Hey, stop scrolling for a second. What you're about to hear really happened, and it still gives me chills every time I tell it. A young mother, just trying to survive, ends up working in a mansion where every hallway hides a secret. She thinks the man of the house never notices her. She thinks no one sees the cruelty she suffers behind closed doors. But someone was watching, every single moment. And when the truth finally came out, it didn't just change her life. It changed everything for the family living in that house. Stay with me because this story gets unbelievable. Welcome back, friends. I'm so glad you're here with me today. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Which country do you belong to? Drop it in the comments. I love knowing how far this little corner of the internet reaches. Today's story is one of the most emotional, heartwarming, and honestly shocking stories I've ever shared with you. It's about power, cruelty, hidden kindness, and a secret that changes two families forever. I promise you, you won't see the ending coming. Let's begin. Nobody in that town knew Rosa Delgado's name, but everyone knew her face. Tired, kind, always moving fast. Rosa was 34 years old, a single mother of two, living in a small rented apartment on the edge of Greenwich, Connecticut, where the rich built their mansions like fortresses and the working class cleaned the floors inside them. Her daughter, Mia, was 7. Her son, Leo, was 4. Their father had left 2 years earlier, and since then, Rosa had worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. When the agency called her about a live-in housekeeping position at the Whitmore estate, she almost said no. Live-in meant leaving her children with her sister most nights. But the pay was more than double what she made cleaning offices downtown, and desperation has a way of making impossible choices feel necessary. The Whitmore estate sat on 11 acres behind iron gates, a white stone mansion with more rooms than Rosa had ever counted. It belonged to Daniel Whitmore, a billionaire tech investor known across the country for his quiet, almost reclusive nature. He was rarely photographed, rarely interviewed. Some called him cold. Others called him a genius who simply didn't need the spotlight. His wife, Isabella Whitmore, was the opposite in every way. Isabella was beautiful, magnetic, and always camera-ready, the kind of woman who filled a room with perfume and presence before she even spoke. To the outside world, she was the perfect wife. Charitable galas, magazine covers, a warm smile for every photographer. But behind the estate's heavy oak doors, Rosa would learn a very different truth. From her very first week, Isabella made it clear that Rosa was invisible unless something displeased her. A wrinkle in a tablecloth. A vase moved 2 inches to the left. A meal served 3 minutes late. Small things became explosions. Isabella's voice would rise, sharp and cutting, calling Rosa careless, stupid, ungrateful for the job she'd been generously given. Rosa endured it. She had to. Every dollar she earned went straight to Mia's school shoes, Leo's medicine, rent that never stopped rising. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she'd save enough and leave within a year. What she didn't know was that Daniel Whitmore was almost never actually absent, even when he seemed to be. He traveled often for business, yes, but the estate had a security system he'd personally designed, cameras hidden in nearly every room, feeding directly to a private screen in his home office. It wasn't installed to spy on his wife. It had been installed 2 years earlier, after a string of thefts by previous staff. But once it was there, Daniel found himself watching more than he ever expected to. He saw the way his wife spoke to the staff when she thought no one who mattered was listening. He saw the fear in their eyes. And more than once, late at night, alone with a glass of untouched scotch, he saw the way Rosa Delgado quietly took every insult without a single word of complaint, the way she'd go into the pantry afterward, close the door, and press her palm against her chest like she was holding herself together by force. Something about her reminded him of someone. He couldn't place it yet, but it gnawed at him. One evening, 3 weeks into Rosa's employment, Isabella hosted a dinner for 12 of her closest friends, women in silk dresses and diamond earrings, laughing over wine that cost more than Rosa's monthly rent. Rosa served the courses in silence, moving carefully, professionally, invisible the way she'd learned to be. Then it happened. A crystal wine glass slipped from the tray, not dropped, not thrown, simply slipped, the way exhausted hands sometimes fail after a 16-hour day, and shattered against the marble floor. The room went silent. Isabella's smile vanished. "Get out," she hissed, low enough that her guests could pretend not to hear, but sharp enough that Rosa felt it like a slap. "Get out of my sight before I say something I'll regret." Rosa knelt to clean the glass with trembling hands, apologizing over and over, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall in front of strangers. What none of them knew, what Rosa herself didn't know, was that upstairs, in a private office with a bank of quiet screens, Daniel Whitmore had just set down his phone and was watching every second of it happen in real time. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, something inside him, something he'd buried under boardrooms and spreadsheets and years of quiet detachment, began to stir. That night changed nothing on the surface. Rosa cleaned the glass, finished her shift, and cried quietly into her pillow in the small staff quarters at the back of the house, thinking of her children asleep 30 minutes away in her sister's cramped apartment. But upstairs, Daniel Whitmore couldn't sleep. He replayed the footage 3 times. Not because he enjoyed watching his wife humiliate someone, the opposite. Each time his stomach twisted tighter. He thought of his own mother, a woman who had cleaned houses in Ohio for 20 years before he'd made his first million, a woman who had come home some nights with her hands cracked and bleeding from bleach and cold water, only to be spoken to like she was less than human by the families she worked for. He'd promised himself, as a boy watching his mother cry silently at the kitchen table, that if he ever had power, he would never let anyone be treated that way in his home. And yet it had been happening under his own roof for months. Maybe longer. He simply hadn't been watching closely enough, or he told himself it wasn't his place to interfere in household matters. The next morning, he did something he rarely did. He canceled his flight to San Francisco and stayed home. He found Rosa in the kitchen at 6 a.m., already working, dark circles beneath her eyes. She startled when she saw him. The staff rarely interacted directly with Mr. Whitmore. "Good morning, sir," she said quickly, straightening. "Can I get you anything?" He studied her for a long moment. Up close, there was something in her face, the shape of her eyes, maybe, or the way she held her shoulders, that tugged at a memory just out of reach. "Rosa," he said, and she looked surprised he knew her name. "Delgado, right? Is your family from Ohio, originally?" She blinked, thrown by the question.
"No, sir."
"Guatemala, then Texas. Why do you ask?" He shook his head slowly, unsettled by his own reaction. "No reason. Just, you remind me of someone." He didn't tell her what he'd seen the night before. Not yet. Instead, he simply said, "If anyone in this house ever speaks to you in a way that isn't respectful, I want you to come to me directly. Not HR me." Rosa's eyes widened, unsure if this was a trap, a test, or something else entirely. In her experience, the wealthy rarely meant what they said to people like her. "Thank you, sir," she said carefully.
"I've fine."
Truly. But she wasn't fine, and they both seemed to know it. Over the following weeks, Daniel found himself watching the cameras more, not less. He told himself it was about protecting his staff in general. But it was Rosa he watched most, the quiet dignity in the way she worked, the exhaustion she never let show in front of Isabella, the tenderness in her voice on the rare phone calls she took on her breaks, speaking softly in Spanish to her children. One night he overheard, through the audio feed he almost never used, Rosa on a call with her sister, crying softly. "I can't keep doing this," she whispered. "The way she talks to me, like I'm nothing. But Leo needs his medicine and Mia needs new shoes for winter. I have no choice." Daniel sat frozen at his desk, the words landing like a blow. He thought of his mother again. He thought of the promise he'd made as a boy. And he thought, with a growing, uncomfortable clarity, that his wife's cruelty wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern he had chosen, for years, not to see. Something had to change. But he didn't yet know how deep the truth would go, or how close it would come to unraveling everything he thought he understood about his marriage, and about himself. The twist came on a Thursday, the kind of ordinary afternoon that gives no warning before it changes everything. Isabella had a headache and had confined herself to her private sitting room, insisting on total silence in the East Wing. Rosa was assigned to deep clean the walk-in closet, a room the size of Rosa's entire apartment, filled with designer gowns, shoes still wrapped in tissue paper, jewelry boxes she wasn't allowed to touch. While reorganizing a shelf, Rosa's hand brushed a small wooden box tucked behind a row of handbags. It fell, spilling its contents across the floor, old photographs, yellowed with age. Rosa knelt to gather them, and one photo stopped her cold. It was a black and white image of a young woman in a maid's uniform, standing beside a much younger, thinner version of a man Rosa didn't immediately recognize until she looked closer at his eyes. Daniel Whitmore's eyes, but decades younger. Beside him stood an older woman with kind, tired eyes and a gentle smile, her hand resting on his shoulder like she was proud of him. Written on the back in faded pencil, Eleanor and Danny, graduation day, 1994. Rosa didn't understand yet what she was looking at. She simply set it aside to return later. But Isabella chose that exact moment to storm into the closet, headache apparently forgotten, face twisted with fury at finding a stranger's hands near her most private possessions. "What do you think you're doing?" Isabella snapped, snatching the box from Rosa's hands. When she saw the spilled photographs, her face went pale, then furious. "Who told you to touch this? This is not your business. You people always think you can just..." She stopped herself, but not soon enough. The words hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. "You people." Rosa froze, humiliation burning through her chest.
"I'm sorry, Mom."
It fell. "I was only trying to..." "Get out," Isabella said, voice shaking with rage. "Get out of my house. You're done. Pack your things and leave before my husband gets home." For the first time, Rosa didn't move fast enough, didn't apologize fast enough, because something inside her, worn thin by months of silent endurance, finally cracked. "I have worked for you for 4 months without a single day off that you didn't cancel at the last minute," Rosa said, her voice trembling but steady. "I have never once disrespected you. I fell. That's all that happened. I fell." Isabella's hand rose before either of them fully registered it, and it struck Rosa across the face. The sound cracked through the closet like a gunshot. Neither woman noticed the office door down the hall was open. Neither woman noticed Daniel Whitmore, home 2 hours early from a meeting that had ended sooner than expected, standing frozen in the hallway, having heard every word, and having seen, through the open door, his wife strike a woman who had done nothing but exist inside her fury. But it was the photograph still clutched in Isabella's other hand that made Daniel's blood run cold. That photograph was the only image he owned of the woman who had raised him after his own mother died when he was 19, a housekeeper named Eleanor Reyes, who had worked for his family for over a decade, who had held him the night his mother passed away, who had told him, again and again, "Don't ever forget where kindness matters most. Danny, it's not the big gestures, it's how you treat the people who serve you when no one's watching." Eleanor Reyes, Rosa's grandmother, though none of them yet knew it. And Daniel Whitmore, billionaire, silent observer, a man who had spent months watching his household through hidden screens while telling himself he was simply monitoring the property, finally stepped into the doorway and said, in a voice none of them had ever heard him use before, "Isabella, put your hand down and step away from her.
Now."
The room went utterly silent. Isabella turned, and for the first time in their 11-year marriage, she saw something in her husband's eyes that frightened her. Not anger exactly, but something colder. Recognition.
Disgust.
The look of a man who has just seen, with total clarity, exactly who he married. "Daniel," she started, straightening her dress like the moment could be smoothed over the same way. "This isn't what it looks like. She was going through my private things and..." "I watched you hit her," Daniel said quietly. "I heard everything you said before that, too."
"Not just today."
"I have hours of footage, Isabella. Months of it." Isabella's face drained of color. "You've been spying on me?" "I installed those cameras to protect this house from theft," Daniel said. "What I found instead was you treating the people who work here like they're beneath basic human decency." I told myself, for months, it wasn't my business how you spoke to staff. I was wrong. It was always my business. I just didn't want to see it. He turned to Rosa, whose cheek was still red, whose hands were shaking as she held herself together with the same quiet dignity he'd watched for weeks on a screen upstairs. He held out his hand, not to touch her, but to gently ask for the photograph still on the floor. Rosa picked it up and passed it to him, confused, her cheek throbbing, her mind reeling from everything that had just happened in the span of 90 seconds. Daniel looked at the photo, at the woman standing beside his younger self, and his voice broke slightly for the first time. "This woman," he said, "raised me. Eleanor Reyes. My mother died when I was 19, and Eleanor was our housekeeper for 11 years before that. When my mother passed, Eleanor didn't leave. She stayed. She sat with me every night for 3 months so I wouldn't be alone in that house. She taught me everything my own family never had time to teach me: patience, humility, how to treat people who have less power than you." He looked up at Rosa. "Delgado. Your mother's maiden name, is it Reyes?" Rosa's breath caught. "My grandmother's name was Eleanor Reyes," she whispered. "She passed away when I was 12. She used to talk about working for a family in Ohio. She said she loved a little boy there like he was her own grandson." The silence that followed said everything words couldn't. Isabella stood frozen, watching her carefully built world, the perfect marriage, the perfect image, the power she'd wielded so casually for years, begin to collapse in real time, undone not by scandal or business failure, but by a single photograph and a truth she'd never bothered to ask about the woman she'd just struck. "Daniel," she said again, quieter now, almost pleading. "I didn't know. How could I have known?" "You didn't need to know who her grandmother was to treat her like a human being," Daniel said. "That was never the requirement. It was never supposed to be a requirement." He turned back to Rosa, his voice gentler now, though his hands were still visibly trembling with restrained emotion. "I am so sorry. For all of it. For what happened today, and for everything you endured before I finally paid attention." Rosa, still in shock, still holding her stinging cheek, could only nod, unable to find words for a moment that felt too enormous, too impossible to be real. But the story and the reckoning was only beginning. That night, the Whitmore estate felt like a different house entirely. Isabella retreated to the guest wing, uncertain of her place in a home she had once ruled with absolute authority. Daniel insisted Rosa see a doctor, though she assured him, embarrassed, that she was fine, just shaken. He didn't accept fine as an answer. He called his personal physician to the house within the hour and sat with her afterward in the kitchen, two people from impossibly different worlds bound suddenly by a woman neither had expected to think about again. "Tell me about her," Daniel said quietly, nursing a cup of coffee he wasn't really drinking. "About Eleanor. I only knew her as an adult, taking care of me after everything fell apart. I never really knew who she was before that." Rosa smiled for the first time that day, faint but real. "She raised 4 kids alone in Guatemala before she ever left for the States. My mother said she worked 3 jobs some years. She used to say the hardest part of being poor wasn't the hunger, it was people assuming that because you had nothing you deserved nothing. She never wanted us to believe that. She always said dignity wasn't something rich people gave you. It was something you carried yourself, no matter what anyone else did." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, the words landing somewhere deep. "She used to say something almost identical to me. I never forgot it. I just forgot to live it, somewhere along the way." They sat together for nearly an hour, trading pieces of a woman who had shaped both their lives without either of them knowing the other existed. Daniel learning about the grandmother Rosa had lost too young, Rosa learning about the years Eleanor had spent in Ocean and a lifetime away from her own family, caring for someone else's grieving son. There was grief in it, but also something unexpectedly healing, like 2 disconnected threads of the same life finally being tied together. Meanwhile, upstairs, Isabella sat alone, replaying the day in her mind. She wasn't a monster in her own story, no one ever is. She told herself Rosa had provoked her, that the stress of the dinner party, the headache, The years of maintaining a flawless public image while feeling increasingly invisible in her own marriage had all simply boiled over in one unfortunate moment. But beneath the excuses, a smaller, quieter voice, one she'd spent years learning to ignore, whispered a harder truth. You have been cruel to people for a long time, and you told yourself it didn't matter because they needed the paycheck more than they needed your respect. For the first time in years, Isabella cried, not for how the day had made her look, but because some fractured part of her recognized, faintly, that she didn't like the woman that photograph had exposed her to be. Downstairs, Daniel made a decision that would set the next chapter of the story in motion. He picked up his phone and called his lawyer. I need you to draft 2 things, he said. First, a formal separation agreement. Second, I want to set up an education trust for 2 children, Mia and Leo Delgado. On the other end of the line, his lawyer paused. Everything all right, Daniel? Daniel looked across the kitchen at Rosa, who was watching him with cautious, disbelieving eyes, clearly wondering what she'd just overheard. Everything's about to be a lot more right than it's been in a long time, he said. The weeks that followed unfolded like a slow, careful unraveling of everything the Whitmore household had pretended to be. Isabella moved out within 10 days, into a condo in the city, her public image quietly, deliberately protected by Daniel, not out of loyalty, but because he had no interest in destroying someone publicly when he had the far greater task of rebuilding something privately. Their divorce proceeded without scandal reaching the tabloids, though those close to them sensed something fundamental had shifted. Rosa, meanwhile, found herself in an entirely unfamiliar position, no longer certain what her role in the Whitmore house even was. Daniel insisted she take paid leave to recover, though the bruise on her cheek had faded within days. It was the deeper wound, the humiliation, that lingered longer. She spent the time with Mia and Leo, savoring mornings she hadn't had in months, though the uncertainty of her financial future weighed on her constantly. Being struck by her employer, however wealthy or apologetic he was, wasn't exactly a resume builder, and she worried, quietly, about what came next. But Daniel had other plans. He invited her back to the estate, not as staff, but for a conversation. He'd spent the previous 2 weeks going through Eleanor's old belongings, most of which he'd kept in storage for over 15 years without ever fully unpacking them, unable to face the grief. Among them were letters Eleanor had written but never sent, to her daughter, to her grandchildren, to a life she'd sacrificed so much to build for people she rarely got to see. He handed the box to Rosa in the same sitting room where the photograph had first fallen from its hiding place weeks earlier.
These are yours, he said.
They should have been yours a long time ago. I didn't know how to find your family. I'm sorry it took this long. Rosa opened one letter with trembling hands, tears falling before she'd even read a full sentence. Eleanor's handwriting, slanted and careful, spoke of homesickness, of love for grandchildren she'd never fully gotten to know, of hope that one day her sacrifices would mean something for the family she'd left behind in pursuit of a better future. She never stopped thinking about us, Rosa whispered. Even here, doing all of this for a family that wasn't hers. She never treated us like we weren't her family either, Daniel said quietly. That's the part one didn't understand until I was much older. She never made a distinction. She loved fully, regardless of what she got paid to do. It was in that moment, grief and gratitude tangled together, that Daniel made his intentions clear. I don't want you to come back as household staff, he said carefully. I've been in talks with the foundation my company runs. We fund community programs, small business grants, education initiatives in underserved neighborhoods. I want you to help run the new division we're building for working mothers. Job training, childcare subsidies, emergency assistance, the kind of support that would have made things easier for you, and for people like you. You understand what these families actually need better than anyone I could hire with a fancy degree and no lived experience. Rosa stared at him, stunned into silence. Mr. Whitmore, I don't have the experience for something like that. I never finished college. Eleanor didn't have a college degree either, Daniel said gently. She had wisdom no classroom could have taught her, and she used it to shape a broken 19-year-old boy into someone who eventually built a company worth billions. I'm not offering you charity, Rosa. I'm offering you a job you're more qualified for than you realize. The rest, we figure out together. For the first time since the closet, since the slap, since months of swallowing her dignity to survive, Rosa allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't require constant endurance, one that might, instead, require her strength for something worth building. 6 months passed, and the Whitmore estate itself changed in ways few could have predicted. Rosa didn't take the position lightly. She threw herself into the work with the same quiet determination that had once carried her through 16-hour shifts scrubbing marble floors, except now, that determination was building something instead of merely surviving it. The Foundation's new initiative, which Daniel eventually named the Eleanor Reyes Family Fund, launched with a modest pilot program in 3 Connecticut communities: emergency child care grants for single working parents, job placement services, and a small scholarship fund for children whose parents worked in domestic or service industries. Rosa oversaw intake interviews herself for the first several months, refusing to let the program become another faceless bureaucracy. She remembered too well what it felt like to be treated as a number, a liability, an inconvenience. Every family that came through the program left feeling seen, because Rosa made certain of it personally. Word spread quickly. Within the first year, over 400 families had received support. Local news outlets picked up the story, not the scandal of Daniel Whitmore's messy, quiet divorce, which never fully surfaced, but the story of a billionaire quietly funding one of the state's most effective family assistance programs, run by a woman who had once cleaned his floors. Mia and Leo, meanwhile, thrived in ways Rosa had only dreamed of. The education trust Daniel had established covered private tutoring, extracurricular programs, and years down the line would fully fund their college educations, regardless of where their paths led. But more than the money, what mattered to Rosa was the stability. For the first time since their father left, her children weren't watching their mother disappear into exhaustion every single night. Isabella, for her part, faded from the public narrative entirely, choosing a quieter life away from the cameras and galas that had once defined her. There were no dramatic confrontations, no tabloid wars. Occasionally, Daniel would receive word through mutual acquaintances that she'd begun volunteering, quietly, without publicity, at a community shelter downtown. Whether it was genuine transformation or simple self-preservation, no one could say for certain. But something in the story suggested that even cruelty, when finally confronted honestly, could sometimes crack open into something better. Daniel himself changed too, in quieter, more private ways. He began spending more time at the estate instead of traveling constantly for business. He installed a small memorial garden near the kitchen entrance, Eleanor's favorite spot, according to old photographs, with a modest plaque that read simply, "For the ones who serve with love and are too often overlooked.
We see you.
We remember you." It became, without either of them planning it, a kind of gathering place. Staff who worked at the estate now, treated, under Daniel's new policies, with generous wages, defined hours, and mandatory respect clauses written directly into their contracts, would sometimes sit near the garden on their breaks, a small, living monument to a lesson learned too late for Eleanor to see, but not too late to matter. But not everything in the story unfolded gently. As Rosa's visibility grew, as reporters occasionally asked about her unlikely rise from housekeeper to foundation director, old wounds resurfaced in unexpected ways. Rosa's ex-husband, Marco, who had left 2 years earlier without a word, resurfaced when he saw a local news segment featuring Rosa and her children at a foundation fundraising event. He appeared outside her apartment one evening, uninvited, claiming he wanted to be part of the kids' lives again, now that things were going well for them. Rosa felt a familiar knot of anger and grief tighten in her chest. For 2 years, there had been no calls, no support, no birthday cards for Mia or Leo, only silence, until success made reappearing convenient. She almost turned him away entirely. But Mia, now 8, had asked about her father countless times, old enough to feel his absence, but too young to fully understand it. Rosa found herself torn between protecting her children from further disappointment and denying them a chance, however small, at reconciliation. She called Daniel, uncertain why he was the first person she thought to call, uncertain of her right to lean on him for something so personal. "I don't know what to do," she admitted over the phone, voice tight with exhaustion. "Part of me wants to slam the door. Part of me feels like I owe it to my kids to at least let him try." Daniel listened without offering easy answers, without judgment. "You don't owe him anything," he said carefully. "But you don't owe your anger control over your decision either. Whatever you decide, decide it because it's right for you and your children, not because of guilt and not because of spite." It wasn't advice that solved anything cleanly, but it gave Rosa permission to trust her own judgment, something months of quiet self-doubt had slowly eroded. In the end, she allowed Marco's supervised visits, cautiously, on her terms, clear boundaries, consistent effort required, no promises made on his behalf that she couldn't guarantee to her children. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation. Some wounds, she'd come to understand, didn't fully heal. They simply became manageable, survivable, folded into a larger, more complicated kind of peace. Through it all, her friendship with Daniel deepened in ways neither had anticipated when a spilled wine glass first set this entire story into motion. It wasn't romantic, not yet if it ever would be, but something steadier, quieter. Mutual respect built not on power or position, but on shared grief, shared history, and a woman named Eleanor who had, in her own unassuming way, shaped both their lives long before they ever met. 1 year after the incident in the closet, the Eleanor Reyes Family Fund hosted its first anniversary gala, though gala felt like the wrong word for an event Rosa had insisted remain grounded, unpretentious, focused entirely on the families it served rather than the wealthy donors writing checks. The event was held not in a ballroom, but in a community center in Bridgeport, decorated simply, filled with folding chairs instead of gilded seating charts. Families who had received support stood up, one by one, to share what the program had meant to them. A mother who'd finally afforded stable childcare and returned to nursing school, a father who'd found steady work after 8 months of unemployment, a grandmother raising 3 grandchildren alone who'd received emergency assistance after a medical crisis nearly bankrupted her family. Rosa sat near the back, overwhelmed, watching lives she'd helped change unfold in front of her, thinking of her own grandmother, who had never lived to see any of this, who had spent her life serving a family not her own, and quietly hoping her sacrifices would someday matter. When it was Rosa's turn to speak, she stood at the small podium, hands shaking slightly, and found herself abandoning the prepared notes in her pocket. "A little over a year ago," she began, "I was on my knees on a marble floor, cleaning up broken glass, being told I was worthless by someone who had never once asked my name with genuine interest. I want you to know that story because I think too many of us have lived some version of it, made to feel small by people who mistake wealth for worth, and worth for the right to treat others as less than human." The room was silent, every eye fixed on her. "But that same year taught me something I don't think I ever would have learned otherwise," she continued, voice growing steadier. "Dignity was never something anyone could take from me, no matter how hard they tried. It was something I carried, the same way my grandmother carried it her entire life, serving a family with more love than they probably deserved, and shaping a broken young man into someone who, years later, chose to remember her, and in remembering her, chose to see me, too." She looked toward the back of the room, where Daniel stood quietly near the doorway, having slipped in late from a delayed flight, listening with an expression of quiet, overwhelmed pride. "This program exists because one person finally decided to pay attention to the people serving him instead of looking past them," Rosa said. "I hope for every family in this room, and every family we haven't reached yet, that the world gives you people who choose to truly see you, and if it doesn't, I hope you find the strength like my grandmother did, like I did, to hold on to your dignity anyway, until someone finally does." The applause that followed wasn't polished or performative. It was raw, emotional, families rising to their feet, many in tears, recognizing pieces of their own struggle in Rosa's words. Daniel approached her afterward, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. "Eleanor would be proud of you," he finally said. "I think she'd be proud of both of us, honestly, for finally listening." 2 years after a wine glass shattered on a marble floor and changed the course of several lives forever, the Whitmore estate looked different, not architecturally, but in spirit. The staff who worked there now did so under contracts that guaranteed fair wages, defined hours, healthcare benefits, and a zero-tolerance policy toward disrespect, enforced not as empty language in a handbook, but as a value Daniel personally, visibly upheld. The Eleanor Reyes Family Fund had expanded to 7 states, supporting thousands of working families with the kind of dignity-preserving assistance Rosa had insisted upon from day one. No red tape, no condescension, simply real support for real struggles. Mia, now 10, had begun talking about becoming a teacher, inspired by an after-school tutoring program the foundation funded. Leo, 7, still carried a small photograph of his great-grandmother Eleanor in his backpack, a woman he'd never met but had come to know through the letters Rosa read to him at bedtime. Rosa and Daniel's relationship had, slowly and carefully, become something more than friendship, not rushed, not dramatic, but steady, built on years of mutual respect rather than the fleeting excitement Daniel's first marriage had been built upon. Neither felt any urgency to define it publicly. They had both learned, in their own ways, that the truest things in life rarely needed announcement to be real. Isabella, in a quiet twist few could have predicted, eventually reached out to Rosa directly, not for forgiveness exactly, but for something closer to accountability. She'd spent 2 years in therapy, she explained in a brief, carefully written letter, confronting patterns of cruelty she'd absorbed from her own upbringing, patterns she'd repeated without ever truly examining them until the day a photograph and a slap forced her to. "I don't expect you to forgive me," the letter read. "I only wanted you to know that what happened that day didn't just cost me my marriage. It forced me to become someone I'm not ashamed of anymore. I'm sorry it took hurting you to get there." Rosa didn't respond immediately, but eventually she wrote back 3 simple lines. "Thank you for telling me. I hope you continue becoming that person." I mean that. It wasn't friendship.
It wasn't closure exactly.
But it was, perhaps, the most honest kind of ending Cruelty and accountability could offer. Not a fairy tale reconciliation, but a quiet, imperfect kind of growth. On the anniversary of Eleanor's passing each year, Rosa and Daniel would sit together in the small memorial garden behind the kitchen, the one with the modest plaque honoring those who serve with love and are too often overlooked. They'd talk about her, the woman who had, without ever meeting each other, shaped both their lives so profoundly that decades later, a single spilled wine glass would finally bring their separate stories together. "She always said kindness finds its way back around," Rosa said one evening, watching Mia and Leo chase fireflies across the lawn where Eleanor herself had once worked. "I didn't believe her for a long time. It's hard to believe that when you're the one on your knees, cleaning up broken glass." Daniel took her hand gently. "I think she was right, though," he said. "It just takes longer than any of us want it to. And sometimes, it takes someone finally deciding to pay attention." The lesson of this story is simple, but it's one too many of us forget in a world that often measures worth by wealth, title, or power. Dignity is never something anyone has the right to take from you, and true character is revealed not in how someone treats those who can benefit them, but in how they treat those who can't. Kindness, patience, and quiet strength, even when unseen, even when unrewarded, have a way of shaping the world far beyond what we can measure in the moment. If this story moved you the way it moved me while I researched it, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit that like button, subscribe for more stories just like this one, and share it with someone who needs a reminder today that they are seen, they matter, and their dignity is theirs alone to keep, no matter what anyone else tries to take from them. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.